Welcome back to The Art of Zeus, a series on intermediate and advanced concepts of the Arma 3 Zeus game mode. In this episode, we'll be focusing on objectives and mission flow. Being at the core of everything you do as a GM, the importance of high-quality objectives is self-evident. The backbone of the Zeus game mode, your ability to create high-quality objectives and missions, is a direct reflection of your ability as a GM. This is tricky because objectives are multifaceted, with everything from unit and object placement to weather affecting them. With so many factors at play, it's understandable that many, if not most, public GMs are mediocre at best in this regard. If you want to up your Zeus game, pay attention. The art of creating good objectives is easily the most overlooked part of being a great game master. When starting a mission, the first objective acts as the root of your entire operation. It is impossible to understate the importance of having a strong base upon which to build the rest of the mission. Despite what you think, your first objective starts at the very moment you place down the first spawn. If you've been following this guide in previous episodes, then you should remember that in my first episode on setup and first minutes, I went over proper setup of a mission, with first spawn being placed after loadouts and initial setup are completed. Players spawning into your mission are already part of the first objective, even if you haven't created it yet. The weather, music, terrain, nearby clutter are all part of the overall mission flow, more commonly referred to as your storyboard. Your mission should read like a book, and neglecting the first spawn point is an error that I have seen literatum thousands of times. When first starting your mission, decide what your first objective will be before placing the spawn. Flush out the area with some minimal clutter, vehicles, airbase, EI patrol, camp in the woods, what have you. Having a bad first spawn starts your mission out on the wrong foot. It wouldn't make sense for rebels to start out on an airstrip, and it wouldn't make sense for a conventional military to start in the boonies with nothing around them, as for context on why they're there. The most common thing I see overlooked by GMs in regards to the setting is the players. That's right, your story setting includes the players. Identify the number and types of players you will be presiding over, and try to create a mission that plays to their personality strengths. For example, if you have a server full of Rambos, don't try and create a stealth mission. Doing so is just setting yourself up for failure. A sign of a great GM is the ability to admit that the mission they had been planning for the last hour or days just isn't going to work with the current set of players and to adapt accordingly. Here is an image of a standard story arc. For those who have no idea what they're looking at, this graph represents the chain of events that constitute a story, be it written or visual. I promise that the best Zeus missions you have ever had the privilege of being part of fit somewhere on this graph. At the beginning, you have your setting, which would be analogous to your first spawn and everything related to it. Loadouts, weather, location, etc. It doesn't matter if you have a small handful of objects in the starting area, since the players will only be there for a minute or two if you do things correctly. If you plan on having your players return to this area as a home base, you can use the transit time to and from the first objective, extra time to spruce it up. Remember, don't spend your time idly watching the players move around to and from objectives or while they're completing the objective. Utilize every second you can to build, plan, or fine-tune the adventure. Next up on this graph, we have a handful of rising actions. These will be the bulk of your objectives. Each should complement the last and flow smoothly into the next. Even seemingly unrelated objectives can be chained together with a bit of clever object placement or roleplay. It's important to make sure that these objectives each build your story, drawing players in so they want to know what happens next. Nothing stifles disruptive behavior better or faster than an engaging mission. Rising actions are the most effective when they can be graphed as a ramp, with each objective becoming either faster paced, more intense, or more personalized than the previous points. This is not to say that they must be any of these things. Lulls in action can be beneficial or even necessary in any number of situations. Just make sure you pick the correct time to have them. On the flip side, be very careful when using AI force multipliers or large stacks of enemies. In doing so, you're pinching yourself against a proverbial ceiling, leaving little room for following objectives or even climax objectives from topping them. When formulating these middle objectives, make sure you're sizing them correctly and taking the factors outside your control into account. A good GM can adapt to many things and adjust an objective when needed, but only a great GM can alter key objective or plot points without disjointing the rest of the mission. A good sign that you're doing this right is if the players never even knew the plot was doctored on the fly. Don't patronize players that you had a great mission idea or set up, and now you need to set up a new one. It's immature, detrimental to your mission, and damages your reputation, with no clear benefit. In relation to sizing, creating an objective with only a handful of enemies in a small place may not be appropriate for a large server, since only a few lucky players would get kills, even if it would fit perfectly into your narrative. Rising action objectives should also avoid doubling back on the same territory too much. Going past the same scenery or combat zone multiple times in a short amount of time is boring. Beyond the rising actions, you have the climax point. This is where your control mastery and creative prowess can bloom. The climax should be the high tide point of your mission and should be a significant challenge to the players. Most climax objectives contain a facet not found in previous objectives, such as hostile gunships, tanks, officers, civilians, something that sets it apart other than just more soldiers. A good climax should last anywhere between 10 and 40 minutes, depending on the size of the server and the patience of the players. Any shorter, and players may not be able to fully enjoy what you've set up, and too much longer than this, the adrenaline high wears off and fatigue starts to set in, with all the misery that it brings along with it. A climax should always have some kind of action involved. Otherwise, you run the risk of ending your mission on a flat note or a rut that leaves players with a bad taste in their mouth, saying things like, "Is that it?" These flat note endings most commonly manifest in the form of ending a mission after players return to base rather than soon after the final objective was completed. Don't force your players to RTB if you're just going to end the mission. The only variation a great mission makes on a storyline arc is the notable absence of a meaningful resolution. While it's not impossible to create a good resolution, the tools present in Zeus and the very nature of a resolution makes it extremely difficult to pull off, making them only reasonable in a very limited set of scenarios. Here are a few pointers on the topic of resolution and post-climax activities. When building your climax objective, think of an out, or something that will happen when the objective is completed or failed. If you have ever had a Zeus that asks you to wait around or RTB after each objective, they likely weren't thinking ahead. Don't make players RTB after a giant last fight. I just went over this. Don't make players RTB after a giant last fight. Just end the mission once they are in transit to the base. Don't let them get all the way there. If your objective relies on an extract, make sure that extract location makes sense and don't trust the AI to do it correctly. A Spec Ops team shouldn't be getting a helicopter extract in the middle of an airbase or a major city, and they certainly shouldn't be coming in high. Rather, they should be hugging the ground, giving the feel of stealth. Don't complete the climax objectives immediately after everything has been killed. Instead, wait a minute or two after, as players will be on guard, and doing so will give a feeling of the dust settling after such high-octane action. Don't say, "There's only one guard left," either. If the players think the area is clear and there's only one guy left in the corner of the objective, just delete the AI. Forcing players to clear an area 100% will do more harm than good. Music is your friend. Use it. If you're a player who mutes music, I would strongly recommend you turn it on for your next Zeus missions, or even just keep the volume low if you really don't like it. If you're a GM who doesn't use music, shame on you. You really ought to. With the macro mission view behind us, I'll now turn to the micro of individual objectives. I will stress that this will be focusing on the story and connection between objectives in the frame of each operation as a whole, not the individual placement of objects, which will be covered in its own video. When designing individual objectives, make sure that you plan out the 5 W's. Who, what, when, where, and why. Who is supposed to be there? What are they doing? When did they arrive? Where did they come from? And why are they there? If you fail to answer any of these questions for each objective, players can feel like the experience is disjointed or doesn't make much sense. Your first spawn is also subject to these questions. Neglecting them is just plain lazy. It may seem small, but it really does matter in the larger scenario. Let's build an objective from scratch and walk through the process. Before doing anything else, we must know what the objective is and what the players are currently doing. Let's assume we are playing as NATO and the enemy is Syndicate. We pick our objective as rescuing a downed chopper crew if they're still alive. Before even considering moving forward with this objective, we need to make sure that it makes sense with the larger picture of the whole story. It wouldn't make sense for this chopper to be downed after the players finish off what we told them would be the last remaining enemy force on the island. Next, we must decide where to place this objective. What was this chopper doing when it was shot down? Why was it in the area? Does it make sense for enemy to be here? At this point, you should start building the objective, placing core objects, the destroyed helicopter, and other things that must be placed first, such as the pilots. Moving on, we have to decide how the chopper was shot down. In this case, technicals and other heavy guns are the best bet, since Syndicate rebels generally don't have access to manpads or missile-based AA. You should assign objective to the players if you have not done so already. They will take time to get there, and you can finish fleshing out the objective while they're in transit. Don't complete the objective completely before assigning the objective. This is a colossal waste of time. There should also be a few unarmed vehicles for transport, as the rebels likely didn't walk to the crash site. They should also be grouped near the vehicles and the crash site, with a handful spread out in patrol circuits. Don't just leave the AI in their default grouping. It's really lazy and it's really obvious that you've done that. At this point, you'd be checking to see how far away the players were, then going back and just fleshing in with small details like garbage, burning barrels, tents, what have you, until they get there. Voila, your objective is complete. And you can start working on the next one while your players tackle this current mission you just set up. It's good to watch the players a little bit to make sure nothing's going too horribly wrong, but you really shouldn't be spending the entire time watching them. Set up the next objective while they're working on that one. With this knowledge, you should have all the tools you need to create engaging stories and plot lines on the fly. If you're having trouble thinking of a good mission, take time out of game and come up with a rough storyboard. Don't make it too detailed, as you'll likely have to adjust the mission depending on the players and how they play. Include contingency plans for an objective failure or other fringe scenarios, and try again the next time you get into the GM spot. Above all, make sure your mission is enjoyable and diverse. Nobody wants to play the same style of objective for 2 hours straight. Before I go today, I'm just going to go over a few common objective types I see that should either never or rarely be done. First, we'll start with things that should never be done. I'm only going to list one objective here, and that's checkpoint, because I literally believe there is no point in doing it. It allows only a few players to get the full experience of what's going on. It clogs up comms, and it's just a giant shit show from start to finish. If you've ever done a checkpoint objective, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For things that are rarely done, any objective that requires overseas transport or long-distance transport with vehicles where you only can spawn at your own base should be avoided at all costs. Yes, I understand this makes your life more meaningful and more likely to move tactically, so you don't have to go all the way back to base to respawn, but it's more likely to end up with the pilot crashing or something else silly happening, and your players getting extremely frustrated. If you want to do this, just place the spawn a good 500 meters away from the objective, where the players are in control of their own fate, and not up to some pilot to get them there. Convoy missions. I used to be a big supporter of convoy missions, but the more I reflected on it, I realized that too much time is spent herding players into, around vehicles, and the AI are likely to wipe out an entire team if the driver is incapable or just gets plain unlucky. They can create extremely tense moments, which are great, but for what it costs you to get to that point, to make that intense moment, it's not worth it. I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in a few weeks.